So, you know, looking out at this audience, there are quite a few of you I know who could be up here doing this intro instead of me, because we all know David and Dana so well. But I'm going to do it anyway. So good evening, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we really are delighted, very delighted, extremely delighted to be hosting journalist David Finkel, who's here to talk about his new book, An American Dreamer, Life in a Divided Country. If you've followed David's work over the years, you know he's a master of immersion reporting and has a way of zeroing in on the lives of people to produce compelling narratives that explore often difficult topics. The people who award the MacArthur Fellowships, in giving David one about a dozen years ago, praised him for, quote, pushing beyond the constraints and conventions of traditional news writing. Working for the Washington Post since 1990, David has applied his talents to stories not only around America, but also abroad in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. In 2006, he won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for a series about U.S.-funded democracy efforts in Yemen. And his two previous books, both critically acclaimed, also were deep dives into the lives of his subjects. In The Good Soldiers, he focused on a U.S. infantry battalion during the 2007 troop surge in Iraq. And he followed that work in 2013 with Thank You for Your Service, which was an account of how some of those same soldiers struggled after they returned home. The main character in An American Dreamer, David Cummings, also featured in The Good Soldiers. The new book follows Cummings for 4 years between the presidential elections of 2016 and 2020 and provides an immersive portrayal of contemporary America through the eyes of this Iraqi war veteran, his family, and his neighbors in a town in Georgia. It's a story about people wrestling with questions and searching for purpose and meaning in a pivotal time in our nation's history. Focused in perspective, but enormous in impact. That's how a review in Booklist described this illuminating book. And here's what the Minneapolis Star-Tribune had to say about it. Quote, "This book is a fast read, but a simple style does not mean a simple book. It is deeply reported and weaves together multiple themes. Finkel witnessed most scenes himself and asked people what was going through their minds. The result is a narrative that both shows and tells." Now, in conversation with David will be another very accomplished Washington Post journalist, Dana Priest, who has spent a lot of her time at the paper on military intelligence and national security affairs. I have a particular connection with Dana. She and I were teammates on the Pentagon beat for the Post in the mid-1990s, so I can personally attest, well, I can personally attest to a lot of things, but particularly her exceptional doggedness and resourcefulness on stories and her wonderful collegiality around the newsroom. She's won 2 Pulitzers for her journalism and authored 2 great books, The Mission and Top Secret America. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David and Dana.
Well, welcome everybody. I get to do just a tiny bit of my own introduction to David because I've known him for so long. And hold the mic close. Okay, so I called up Phil Bennett today, who was his editor for so long, and David did his first overseas story under Phil when he went to Macedonia, Kosovo border, and didn't really know what he was doing, and ended up in the middle of 6,000 refugees figuring out how do I get a story. And long and short of it is you hopped on a tractor. You hopped on a farmer's tractor who was giving out bread and water and just watched the scene. And what Phil says about it, it was only 800 words, which is pretty short for a story. But Phil summed it up by saying, David's eyes become your eyes. David's experience becomes your experience, which is so true because he paints, because he gets so close to his subjects, he just paints their pictures so well that you're there. And that's what Phil. And then another thing he said was, he was there during the surge and we all kind of forgot about him because we were running around with our heads cut off trying to keep up with all the news. And, you know, one day I said, I should probably give him a call and see what he's doing. And when he did and heard his voice, he realized how isolated he was and said he felt like he was talking to an explorer on the Arctic because you were so isolated. And so I wanted to, one more, David's also an editor now, and he once edited me when I did a long series. And just to dispel the idea that he's just a very nice person, he's also a taskmaster, and I will never forget him saying these exact words, "This is the worst sentence I've ever read."
It was. It was. Oh, my God. Oh, it was.
Okay.
No, it wasn't. It was the best sentence she ever wrote, and it was a fine piece of work. It was great.
Okay. Now, on to your book.
A long time ago.
A long time ago. So why don't we start with the beginning of the book?
Okay.
Do you want to read, you want to tell us a little bit about the context and then read the first excerpt?
Yeah.
Read the first page?
Look, the first thing I want to say is it's a lot of people here, and I know most of you, and that's kind of nice. And I'm not quite sure if this is a book event or an intervention, but but I guess we'll figure out as it goes along.
A little bit of both.
So I think if I just read the intro, maybe that'll help set it up. All right, so this is how the book starts. It was November, and I will say, as an editor, I'm always telling my reporters to write short sentences. This, what I'm about to read, contains a sentence that has 148 words in it. So much for that. It was November 3rd, 2020, Election Day, and soon after Brent Cummings woke up, he called out, "Hey, I'm going to vote." Who in this big house heard him? He wasn't sure. Probably no one, he realized. His wife, Laura, was already gone. His older daughter, Emily, was away in college, and his younger daughter, Meredith, was asleep in her bedroom. A marriage going on 26 years, a 21-year-old daughter, an 18-year-old daughter, 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a front porch with a couple of rocking chairs, a large backyard where his daughters had spent hours bouncing on a trampoline in the warming sunshine of Georgia. This was the life Brent Cummings had built since his days as a soldier in the Iraq War, although another way to describe that life was that the trampoline had eventually become covered in leaves and hauled away. His younger daughter, who'd been born with Down syndrome, had mysteriously stopped speaking. His older daughter was twirling her hair a lot and wringing her hands sometimes and feeling anxious about her future. His wife, normally so upbeat, was spending more and more time fighting off feelings of melancholy, and somewhere in all of this, he had become middle-aged. Out of one war and into another, that was how life in the United States was increasingly feeling to Brent.
Okay, Brent.
Yeah.
How did you meet him?
Well, I first met Brent in 2007 when I was writing a book about the Iraq War, and I spent a year embedded with an Army battalion on a base in eastern Iraq. And there were 800 guys in this battalion, and they had a pretty rough go of it. It was not an easy deployment, as so many weren't. And Brent and I lived next to each other, so I got to know him quite well. And one of the things, you know, it's all so fresh as a thing. And one of the things that stuck with me is that this was combat, and it was It was not a polite place. But again and again, I would see Brent in the midst of this trying to behave in the most humane and decent way and try to think his way through the most absurd and the toughest of situations with the humanity that I didn't quite expect, almost a deep moral sense to him. So that's when I got to know Brent. And then when you fast forward up until when I wanted to write a book about what the country is going through now, it seemed in 2016 that we had moved beyond a political moment into something, into something almost like a moral reckoning in this country was underway. And I wanted to write about that. And the way I do things is I find a character and I stick with the character. And Brent was the obvious choice, partly because I saw how he behaved in Iraq, how thoughtful he was, and partly because he said to me one day, what we were just talking about, I feel like I've survived one war only to end up on the edge of another. And that's a good character and a good moment.
So I think the next excerpt that I'd like you to read is 183, and that gives a really good sense of that searching always for the right thing to do.
Okay. So, yeah, what would the setup be for this, do you think? I guess just read it, right? Mm-hmm. Hope the words carry the moment. It was just a day during the reporting. And again, my method of reporting is to just show up and hang out and see what happens. And I hope a story develops. There's not, in immersion reporting, the story hasn't happened yet, and you do interviews to tell the story. It's just there's a really good character on the edge of a really good moment, and you just kind of show up and you hang out until the story develops. And this was one of the things that happened. When Brent was home and outside, everything was fraying. That's what it felt like. It was nighttime now. It started to rain, and Brent went out onto his front porch. All during his time in Iraq, he'd held on to a vision of what would be waiting for him after the war. And the porch was always part of the deal, along with his dog, a beer, and a rainstorm. Yes, it was sentimental, but to a man who had been scared sometimes and often lonesome, it had seemed a version of life worth defending. If only things had worked out that way. It was a big thunderstorm, but Brent stayed on the porch anyway. The soldier, I'm sorry, a little thunderstorm going on here, Brent said. Forgive me. Brent called a soldier he had been with in Iraq. Hey, sir, the soldier said. A little thunderstorm going on here, Brent said, in case the soldier was hearing explosions. It was a big thunderstorm, but Brent stayed on the porch anyway. The soldier wanted to know what life was like after the Army, and they talked about the meaning of what they had done and the value of it. And then, boom, Brent said, all of it goes away. You know, what am I going to do today? You know, so it's just weird, a weird, anxious feeling, or at least it was for me. Hey, sir, thanks, the soldier said at the end of the conversation. Be safe, man, Brent said. And 10 minutes later, he was still on his porch, listening to the rain. The garage door opened next door, the garage door closed, everything was dark, more thunder, it was turning into one of those nights. He didn't want to go to sleep because he knew the dream would be waiting, a dream he sometimes had would be waiting. And the reason it would be waiting was because he was thinking now about what all of them had been through, including the day he almost died under the fuel truck, the day he almost died when he was waiting for his laundry, the day he almost died in the mortar attack that blew out his window, the day he almost died in the rocket attack that decapitated a contractor, the day he almost died in another rocket attack when the chaplain was in the midst of giving him a haircut, the day he almost died when a roadside bomb exploded just after his Humvee had passed where the bomb had been buried, the day he almost died, which had been every day, 14 months in Iraq and 28 years in the Army, all in the name of defending democracy, and now he wasn't defending it, he was in it just in time to feel it unravel.
So, a little bit more about your method.
Yeah.
Are you on the porch with him?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been in Iraq with him, all the things I described in that paragraph.
Why isn't he paying attention, or why isn't he expecting you to ask him questions? I mean, how are you getting him to?
Well, I think in this kind of reporting, you get to a point, and again, I've had 15 years with this guy, but you get to a point where silence becomes a very useful, good reporting tool. I was just around, and he didn't feel a need to host me to fill up every moment with exclamation or noise. We had reached a point with each other where, we can argue whether it's ever entirely a pure moment, but I think with Brent, because of our history, it's as close as you can get to that. And so it was just a night on a porch, and maybe that doesn't seem terribly interesting. It's just a guy sitting on a porch, but if you know enough history, if you know enough of the story, if you can blend all those things in and bring all those to the moment, it was quite an emotional, significant night for him.
Because you've already talked to him about his dream home when he gets back, the
Everything,
porch, and
sure.
yeah.
And here he was. There's so many things that made Brent a good character. One is, I think any of these guys I wrote about in the first book are really good guides through whatever the country is going through. I think they earned us paying attention to them by what they had done in Iraq. And maybe that's sentimental on my part, but I believe that. This is a guy, when he says he feels like he's on the edge of another war now, that's based in him knowing what a war is like. He did what most of us don't do. He went and he was in a bad place defending the country. So he has a certain belief that carries forward to this moment. The other thing about Brent, beyond his sense of morality, is he's in some ways, the books I wrote about Iraq and the guys coming home and trying to get better, and Bill, you and I talked about this once early on. These in some ways were books about them. What Brent was going through now, Brent wasn't them anymore, and he was us. We're all going through a version of this, and that also attracted me to Brent, because he's not a politician. He's not extreme in his views. He's pretty much a man in the middle. He might be a little more Republican than Democrat, might be a little more conservative than liberal, but he just has these bedrock beliefs that most of us in the middle are clinging to as we're watching this urgent moment of what's going on in the country. And based on what he had been through and what he's going through now as things are falling apart around him and he's feeling everything that he tried to defend freeing, God damn, that's a good character.
Yeah.
And it's us. It's not a them anymore, it's an us.
So along that line, one of my favorite scenes is on page 15. Would you please open your book?
Okay.
And one of the things that you do so well is find deep meaning in everyday occurrences, and this is one of those times.
Okay. This is sometimes, I guess, what the benefits of this reporting can reveal. It might seem tedious, but to me it's a benefit. We're in Brent's kitchen with his wife, Laura, and in the kitchen, as the excerpt says, there were 2 ovens in this kitchen, 2 ovens actually, stacked vertically in a wall. He had bought them to replace their old, dying ones, and after they'd been installed, forgive me, he looked at them and realized they weren't lined up correctly. The bottom one seemed a little off. He got out a tape measure, and sure enough, it was left of center by maybe 1/4 of an inch. So he called the place he had bought the ovens from, and they sent out a repairman who said, yes, the bottom oven was off, but that it was a manufacturing problem. So he called the manufacturer, and they sent out a repairman who looked at the ovens and looked at Brent and said, this is a big deal to you? Yeah, Brent said, it is. And the repairman kept looking at it and finally said he could understand why, because maybe they'd sell the house one day, and it was the kind of thing an Indian might notice. And I don't mean a Native American, he added. And Brent thought, what? How to get an oven fixed turned so quickly into that? And this was an instance where Laura was in absolute agreement because similar things had been happening to her. Mundane things that suddenly weren't as mundane as a trip to a grocery store one day where they were giving out cheese samples. What kind of cheese is it, she'd asked. This is white American, the woman working there, who just handled a sample to another customer, an Asian woman, had said. And then she added, like you and me. Laura had felt so embarrassed. She was sure the other woman had heard. She had wanted to say something. But what? Brent, on the other hand, had said to the repairman, "Well, I'm not Indian, and I noticed." But that was as unsatisfying in its own way as saying nothing at all. Maybe Laura was right, that he was getting angrier, but maybe what he was angry about was the country he had spent most of his life defending being overtaken by something he didn't fully understand. Patriotic cheese, xenophobic ovens. These were his days now, the days of a moral man in the midst of a moment that felt immoral to him, a man who got into bed every night wondering in silence whether this would be another night for the dream he was having. It was what he was wondering when he went to bed on November 3rd, 2020, and what he had been wondering 4 years before on the previous election day, November 8th, 2016, when, as he'd gone to sleep, Hillary Rodham Clinton was leading Donald Trump and was about to become President of the United States. Lights out. November 9th, 2016. No dream, he realized with relief as he awakened, turning on the TV. What the fuck? What, Laura had said. He fucking won, Brent said. Are you fucking kidding me, she said. They both stared in disbelief. He's our fucking president, he said.
Well, I want to focus on xenophobic ovens.
Okay.
Did you anticipate that race and divisions would be such a big issue, because they come up repeatedly and really quickly in the book?
They do. There's so many tests that Brent goes through in the course of this book, and no, I wasn't expecting anything at the beginning because I didn't know what was going to happen. And there, as the book progresses, you can almost see this man who is baffled by what's going on at the beginning. By the end, beyond bafflement, into a kind of anger as all the things he's experienced, whether it's in the driveway talking to his neighbor next door, whether it's in Costco where suddenly a woman is pouring water all over herself and screaming, "Why do I have to take off my mask? Why do I have to wear a mask?" Just everywhere there was a coarseness taking place, and there was an opportunity for division anywhere he went. And watching him try to navigate it, and then changing in the process from someone who again was quizzical to the end when things went so badly after January 6th and January 20th. It's quite an evolution that a lot of us have gone down. And I need to stress one point. The book, I need to say, it's not a political book. It's not an anti-Trump book. It's not a pro-Trump book or pro-Biden or anti-Biden. It's using the moment to explore a character who I hope that we can recognize in some ways. And again, it's not Trump's policies that bothered Brent so much. It was his vulgarisms, his continual lying, his lack of, to Brent, moral behavior, the coarseness of the moment that was getting ever coarser. That's why he disliked Donald Trump so much.
Well, there's another scene on page 28 that, I mean, one of the things you do constantly in the book, and it's so wonderful to be able to read it like that, is you weave together the present and the past. And you've already given us a couple examples, but I really like this one as well. So set it up by talking about his work with the cadets.
Sure. So over this 4-year period, Brent, when I began it, he was still in the Army. By the time the book is done, he's out of the Army. But he had several jobs while I was following him. One was when he was in charge of an ROTC program at the University of North Georgia, where this excerpt is from. After that, he went to Jerusalem for a year, and he was trying to help solve the Israeli-Palestinian divisions, and so he was there for that. And then he came back, and he eventually retired and finally came face to face with the country he had not been present for, but had been trying to defend. This little scene takes place when he was running the ROTC program at the University of North Georgia. When they screwed up, they would have to knock 3 times on his door and come in, and then he would, I mean, they were just terrified of this guy, you know, going to see big Brent Cummings, and they would come in, these kids just shaking, and he'd have to kind of dress them down and talk to them a little bit and discipline them. So I'm going through this succession of kids coming in, and the excerpt
And
is...
you're just sitting next to Brent, or you're in the corner?
No,
or
I'm in a
you're
corner.
In the closet, or
Yeah,
where are you?
I'm
A little peephole.
I am in a corner in a really uncomfortable chair, afraid to move because you don't want to just kind of change the atmosphere of the room, trying to take notes. But anyway, so in these kids are coming, and it's pretty priceless and it's pretty sweet. I mean, these are just they're brilliant kids, and they're just dopes. You know, they're just dopes. They're kids doing the stupidest things, and he's got to deal with this. And they're all 19, and this excerpt is: one other thing Brent understood about being 19 was the part these cadets couldn't understand, not yet, and Brent hoped not ever. The part about being in a war at the far end of an order that started with the president and worked its way down to generals, to colonels, to lieutenant colonels, to majors, to captains, to lieutenants, to sergeants, to corporals, and finally to a 19-year-old such as Duncan Crookston. He had been one of Brent's soldiers, and when the Humvee he was in exploded from an insurgent's bomb, he lost his right leg, his left leg, his right arm, and his lower left arm, and he was burned over most of what was left of his body. He didn't die, not then. It took 30 surgeries to keep him alive, and almost 5 painful months for him to die. And I'm sorry, I'd forgotten about this.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. After he did die. Sorry. You want to read it?
Yeah.
No, give me a minute. This is embarrassing. I'm sorry.
No.
After he did die, a memorial service was held back in Iraq, where Brent remembered picking up a general who'd flown him by helicopter to the lousy base where they'd been fighting for their lives. "This is an infantry unit, right?" the general had asked him as they drove away from the landing pad to the chapel. "Yes, sir," Brent had said. "There's not going to be crying here, is there?" the general had asked. "I'm so sick of going to these things and seeing a bunch of boo-hooing. You're not a bunch of pussies, right?" "Sir, I think you will see some tears," Brent had said, and started to explain all that Duncan had meant and how brave his 5-month fight to stay alive had been. But the general wasn't listening, and Brent gave up. He had despised that general, and he'd promised himself that whoever he finally grew up to be after he'd recovered from the war, he would never be a man such as that man. "Report," he said for the next cadet. Once again, the bad door opened, and in came Dante Harris.
Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to move on to Dante Harris.
Okay.
So tell us about Dante is.
Oh.
Dante's a great character in here. So he's a cadet. He's about to walk through the door.
Right.
So who's Dante and what happens to him?
Dante was a guy who had grown up in the worst circumstances. We've read versions of these circumstances before. He was a poor kid, black kid in Georgia, pretty dysfunctional family, and a brilliant guy. And at one point, he had been kicked out of his house. He came home one night after some kind of practice at school, and when he tried to get in, his mother's boyfriend just wouldn't let him in, and they were pushing against the door, and he finally got in, and the guy was saying, "I want you out of here." There's a kid in high school, right? And Dante's mother wasn't doing anything except sitting on the couch. So Dante went and packed up his bags, and he walked out, and he didn't know where to go. So he walked to a park and began sleeping on a sliding board and just living there for a while, for a few days anyway, not knowing what he was going to do, still going to school, where I can tell you he was an extraordinary student, all A's despite everything, and he solved that situation. Somebody took care of him through his senior year. She told him the military might be a good option for you. He applied. He got a full scholarship to the University of North Georgia. It's a pretty good school. And this is great, and it was on merit. So now this kid had a way out, and he's in school, and one day he's in the bathroom, and he comes out of a stall and he sees one of the administrators of the ROTC program standing at a urinal, and his pants were down, and his underpants were down, and everything was kind of around his knees. And Dante thought this was kind of weird, so he surreptitiously took a picture of him. And then he shared it with somebody, and that person shared it with somebody else. He shared it with somebody else, and this was on Election Day, by the way, just as everything was happening, and all the things that happen in this world. And that picture just went around everywhere, and soon Dante was facing charges for acts including taking a picture without permission, indecency. He was facing up to 7 years in prison and in danger of losing everything. And Brent was bothered by this. And Brent's background, among other things, he was born in Mississippi, family that traces back to the Confederacy, guns, truck, dog, hunts, the whole thing. You can make assumptions about Brent Cummings. Brent, for a lot of reasons, was so bothered by what was going on, the perception of what was going on, that he stepped in and he tried to save this guy from being kicked out and losing everything. And he kept saying to himself, what if his name were Daniel Harris? Would this be different here? And he didn't want to accuse the school of overt racism, but people in the school were coming after this kid and trying to get him out. And watching, it's a long chapter, but watching what Brent did to try to save this kid was one more version to me of why I had chosen the right guy to write about.
And you've also juxtaposed it with some of the antics of the white kids, so you don't need to tell the readers anything.
Yeah.
You get it.
No, it's all there.
Very
It's all
powerful.
there. And Dante, he's a good guy. He's a good guy. Hope he's doing okay.
So we're going to do hopefully two more.
Okay.
So Michael is the other big character here.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about Michael, and then we have to read page 141 about the carpenter. This starts with the carpenter bees.
Okay. We okay on time?
Yeah,
Okay.
if you speak.
So Brent now lives, I never really say where he lives in Georgia for several reasons. You know, these are fraught times, and I think Brent's a little concerned when a book like this comes out, whether he might be attacked for saying out loud that he has some problems with Donald Trump. But it's a lovely neighborhood that he lives in, and his next door neighbor refers to it as Pleasantville. His next door neighbor is a guy named Michael Owens, and he is hardcore MAGA all the way. And he's also a guy who is in a wheelchair, and he's been in a wheelchair for several decades because one day he had been in his backyard trying to clean some debris out of a pine tree, and he got dizzy and he fell and he came down on his head and he broke his neck, and he's been a functioning quadriplegic ever since. Wherever he goes, Michael has at least he has a gun strapped to his ankle, and he has another gun in his wheelchair. He can wheel himself, so it's a type of quadriplegia where he has some function. But he's just terrified, right, that Hillary Clinton's going to take his guns away. He won't be able to defend himself. Other people are going to take the life he's tried so hard to maintain away from him. And when he heard Donald Trump, he thought, this is the guy who speaks to me. This is the guy speaking for me. And he loves Donald Trump. And Brent and Michael didn't talk about Donald Trump. They steered clear. They had a sense of maybe there were some differences, and that's how they got along. Except on this day, it didn't quite work out that way. So Brent was outside trying to kill a carpenter bee, and he heard Michael yell, "Hey, Colonel." "Hey, neighbor," he called back, still on his stomach. "I'm trying to get this carpenter bee." And then he stood up because he hadn't talked to Michael much at all since he'd been home. He leaned against the porch railing. He had his new puppy with him, another black lab to replace Tucker, this one named Finn. And Michael had his dog Scout, a small, furry 11-year-old mix. They talked about dogs for a bit. And at some point, Michael said, "I'm glad our governor is getting things reopened." This was during the pandemic. "Yeah, I'm just frustrated at the national level," Brent said. "What do you mean?" Michael said. And that was when, for the first time in all of their conversations over the years, Brent decided to say something about Trump. Before his retirement from the Army, he never would have done such a thing. He had been taught over and over that soldiers weren't supposed to voice public opinion about their commander-in-chief, not unless there was something going on that was illegal, unethical, or immoral. That was the standard. It wasn't blind loyalty, but necessary respectfulness. Soldiers follow orders, after all. But since retiring, he had slowly begun to speak out loud about things, getting used to the idea of free expression, or at least freer expression. And now, referring to what Trump had been saying about the growing pandemic, he said to Michael, "He really lost me when he said, 'I take no responsibility.'" "What do you mean?" Michael asked again, maybe a little sharper. And for the next half hour, things took off from there, leaving everyone with their own differing memories of what had happened. Laura, for instance, would remember going inside to do a puzzle and thinking, "Shut up, stop talking." Michael would remember saying to Brent, "Colonel, let's understand each other about something. I hate everything liberal." And Brent replying, "I hear you. I want this to be clear. I am a Trump supporter. I am a hardcore conservative and far right. I believe in the Bible and the U.S. Constitution as they were written. I understand." And Brent would remember saying to Michael, "I was very disappointed in the president, but not surprised, because he's not a good leader. A leader takes full responsibility." And then he went further. "He lies. He lies to us every day." "When has he ever done that?" Michael asked. So Brent started listing the lies. "Well, all politicians lie. But all politicians don't lie all the time. And that's what he does. He lies all the time," Brent said, and listed some more examples. "I hadn't heard that," Michael said. "I haven't seen that. I haven't seen any of that." Brent began mentioning sources, and Michael pushed back, saying those sources were the liars, not Trump, that the mainstream media lied all the time, incessantly and deliberately, and the proof was that they never went after the left, only the right. Yeah, I understand that point," Brett said. "But the larger point was that leaders should be held to the highest of standards, and Trump was violating that standard every day. I don't trust the man," Brent said. "I don't trust him with your life, with my life, with any life on this street," and then added, "He's unchristian." At least that's the way he would remember the conversation, along with the growing sense that things were getting heated, and that if they kept going, they were going to cross a line that would be difficult to cross back. He tried to bring things to a cooler level. "I'm just frustrated," he said. "I do want to rally around our flag. I do want to support our president." "Hey, Colonel, I respect you," Michael said. "Well, I really enjoyed talking," Brent said. "Got to get back to the bees." He liked Michael. He admired him, and he liked having him as his neighbor. But this now felt different. Until that conversation, Brent hadn't realized how devoted Michael was to Trump, and he couldn't help but wonder whether that devotion would be returned. What would Trump think of Michael? What if Michael were invited into the Oval Office, and he went in not walking, but wheeling himself in his chair? Would Trump take Michael's imperfect hand and shake it? Would he mock him afterward like he had mocked other people? He fell from a tree? Winners don't fall from trees. Losers fall from trees. It was easier for Brent to imagine what Trump would think of him. "I'm the ideal, white, guy, veteran. I would fit the American dream for him."
So I got to ask you, Michael meets you.
Yes.
You're from Washington. You're big media.
Uh-huh.
Was he suspicious? How did you win him over? How did you get him to talk to you so
Well,
openly?
I don't know. I'm rather earnest, sincere. I hope my curiosity comes through. And I think he had reservations about me, but we spent a lot of time together. And, I liked him. I learned from him, and I hope he learned from me. We would go on walks together, early morning walks, and just talk about anything, and then get to the point where he's just living his life. And we would go on walks, and this whole walk while he's wheeling himself along this part in Georgia, this walkway, he'd be praying. He'd just be thanking God and Jesus for the life he has, for the wife he has, for everything, and of course for Donald Trump. He was always thanking God for Donald Trump. So one more thing about that section, and it's something I think about, and maybe something we should think about if we're trying to figure out how we want to get through this time. It's Brent and Michael peeled back from the depth of the honest conversation. They didn't go there, and they haven't gone there since. And I find myself wondering, is that willful ignorance not to approach somebody about such a thing? Or is it just a decent way to try to make peace with your neighbor in these times? I don't know the answer, but watching Brent again and again, whether it was Dante Harris, whether it was Michael, whether all the things he would confront over this 4-year period, and seeing how he handled things, sometimes, he would say well, and sometimes a little idiotically. It's maybe there's a bit of a roadmap for some of us, as we're trying to figure out what to do here, maybe.
Okay. We're going to take questions in just a minute, but I was going to have you do one more because
there's nothing left of the book.
I started to think about that. No, there is. We're just skimming the surface. But you end with this is not the end. I held back. I'm not going to have you read the last paragraph. But you do have this wonderful, terrible scene. It's right there. With Brent again trying to be the moral person, and it doesn't always work out. So, and then there's a microphone right here, and
Okay.
we'll take your questions.
Well, I'm afraid this. I hope I get through it this time. This goes back to when he was in Iraq. Everything was kind of falling apart.
Skip and get to the monkey part.
Yeah, our worst nightmare is coming. This is all at the very end of the deployment when things were just cratering, and these guys were just under full out assault all the time. And Brent was in the command center, and everybody was out there just getting fired on. Our worst nightmare is coming true, Brent said at one point on March 26, 2008, as he monitored radio transmissions that were at times difficult to hear because of all the gunfire. March 27th now, mortars, rockets, rocket-propelled grenades, everything. March 28th now, as the soldiers tried to sleep, back in the U.S., Donald Trump was announcing the newest winner on his TV show Celebrity Apprentice. "You're a vicious guy," Trump was saying to the winner, in a viewing audience of 12 million people, his way of offering congratulations. March 29th, was that faint noise a boom? Another second or two went by, then someone was on the radio screaming. One vehicle destroyed, soldiers in need of evacuation. A few minutes passed. The radio was filled with the sound of gunfire. A few more minutes passed. The phone was ringing, and someone's handing the receiver to Brent's commander. "All right, buddy, hang in there, standing by," he said, and hung up. "What'd he say, sir?" Brent asked. 2 KIA, he said, his eyes filling with tears. Brent's were too, and it wasn't long after that when the monitor showed an insurgent coming around the corner of a building and blasting away at a convoy, unaware of the remote camera locked in on him and that he was about to be shot into too many pieces to count, that Brent began to yell, "Die, monkey, die." Around the room, heads turned. "Die, monkey, die," he yelled again, and now others joined in. Ayeti, who was already dreaming of that burning soldier. Presley, who soon would be going home to his wife and 2 daughters in Kansas. There were a dozen people in the room, and they were all chanting now, led by Brent, who suddenly, hearing himself, stopped. He had never felt more ashamed. "Fight over. Congratulations again on a job well done. I'm really proud of you," his father wrote to him a few days later as his war came to an end. And soon he was home, and soon after that he was having his dream. The first time left him gasping for breath. The second time he understood it would come a third time and a fourth, and it had, hundreds of times since, always the same blackness, always the same laughter at his naivety, right up to January 6, 2020, when he was once again witnessing what one person with enormous power could unleash. All along he had been thinking he had left the war behind, but as he watched the mob swarming the Capitol, it occurred to him that he had been naive. Americans did understand violence, so he had been wrong about that. They were capable of rage, so he had been wrong about that too. And his war wasn't over. It was just that it was here now, not there, and the enemy was no longer them. It was becoming the American next door. His neighbor Michael, Michael's neighbor, him, anyone's neighbor.
Thank you. Okay.
I feel it necessary to point out there are lots of funny moments in this book. Lots of funny moments.
There are actually. I found myself laughing out loud at some points. Yes.
So it sounds like a wonderful book. I'm looking forward to reading it, especially the military part. My connection with the military is my father was an infantryman in the Battle of the Bulge. My late husband was an anti-war activist. That was the Vietnam War, and changed completely the way I think about these things. And I spent 12 years working as a physician at Fort Belvoir and then at Walter Reed. Talk a little bit more about Brent's background. You said he's from Mississippi, from an old, white, I assume, Confederate family. Mm-hmm. But what did he do before he joined the Army, and why did he move to Georgia when he left?
Well, let's see if I can give a short answer. He did grow up in Mississippi. His father was a salesman. His father was also the person, more than any other, who imbued in Brent this sense of fairness. That if you're not guaranteed a good life, if you live a certain way, but you got a shot at it. Mm-hmm. And Brent, Brent's not stupid. He's aware of his advantages, but it was a good, solid, middle-class life, and a lot of it was grounded in the teachings of a father who, for instance, so Brent went from Mississippi and then New Jersey for a while, and then he went to college and a military school, and then he joined the Army, and he was just in the Army for 28 years, and they ended up in Georgia for a lot of complicated reasons. It could have been Kansas. They liked Georgia. Really good school system where they settled for their daughter Meredith, who has Down syndrome, and to go back to the father, one of the things that happened was when Meredith was born, and it became clear that she had Down syndrome. That Brent was terribly upset, and he said to his father, "What do I do?" And his father said, "You're going to love her. You're going to love her," and that's a sentiment and an ethos that Brent has tried to carry forward in all of his dealings, even in combat, even in his dealings with his neighbor Michael. So I mean, I can go through the whole thing of where he lived and stuff, but he's in Georgia because they ended up there for a number of reasons. Mm-hmm. They like it very much. It's a good place. It became a critical state to what happened to him because the book begins with a scene of him voting mm-hmm. in 2020. And then it comes back to that toward the end, because by now when he votes, I mean, if you think about it, a bit corny, but it's voting is the great pure thing we can do in a democracy, right? It's just, if he's looking for a life of meaning and he's no longer in the military, what can he do that has meaning in this time? He can vote.
Is he working, by the way?
Yeah, and he loves to vote. So he voted, and then at the end, to see that vote, I mean, this is a guy who, you've heard me talk about all he did is for his country, blah, 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 blah. He votes. And then that vote is attacked in Georgia and everywhere. And a vote becomes something now to disbelieve, to have doubts about, rather than to believe in. And that went so far in furthering his transition. So
it's just important for me to say, because nobody's waiting, this didn't start in 2016 or in 2000. This started in 1968.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You have another? Well, I have another question.
Okay. I hope it doesn't involve reading another excerpt.
No.
I got nothing left. I can read the first excerpt again.
No. What did Brent think of the book? Have you gotten feedback?
Yeah. You know, I think Brent and Laura, well, first of all, I mean, they had to be sticking around their lives for 4 years. That's a hell of a commitment on their part, and they didn't back away from it. But I think as things went on and things became more tense in the country, they began wondering if this is how it might come back on them. And they did become a little nervous about it. When the book came out, as soon as I got copies of the book, I sent one down to Brent. And things had gotten a little tense between us, and we hadn't talked in a couple of months because he really was, I think it's fair to say, overwhelmed with worry about what he had committed to here. And he knows the deal for my first book. I'm not writing this book to him. I'm writing this book about him for people who, if I can be honest, don't give a shit about him. And I have to tell a story in a way that's honest, that's fair, but also makes people care about this guy in the way I've come to care about him.
Wait, what got tense?
Well, I went down. There's a thing you do in journalism that's kind of this no surprises thing, where you sort of go down, and it's fact checking before the book becomes a solid thing with the publisher. You kind of go through it so that people will know what's coming, and they won't be surprised when the book comes out. They can't read it. That's an ethical no-no. But you can go through it thoroughly enough that they won't be surprised when the book comes out. And after I did that with Brent, I think he had some concerns, not factual concerns, but again concerns about how this might affect the life he and Laura had so carefully built. So we were used to talking quite a lot, and that stopped for a while. And then the book, I got the book, and I overnighted a copy to him, and then I went down to see him, and he had changed. He liked the book, I think. He said it's not the book I would have written, but this was nice. He said you're a good writer. I liked hearing that. He said you tell a good story, and you were there for everything. There's nothing wrong with the book. And he also said, I have to tell you that before I read it, what I was concerned about is people who read the book, what they would think of me. Now that I've read it, my concern is about people who don't read the book. What are they going to think about me? So I thought that was a fairly good endorsement that the book rang true with him, and it got to something large.
So obviously, in such a divided country, reading about people who like Trump or don't like Trump could have people coming out of the woodwork, making their feelings known. Has that happened at all to anybody in the book?
Not yet, but it's early on, and
Yeah.
The way I've kind of blabbed on tonight, I think you're all going to go home and just start marching with coattails or something. I don't know. I don't know what the reaction will be.
Yeah.
You never know. This is a. It was a hard book, especially compared to the other two in a way. But I hope people read it. I think he's a great character. I think his wife Laura, I loved writing about her and trying to bring what her version of life right now in America is like, when her whole life is circumscribed by an attempted fear-mongering, a political attempted fear-mongering, and her whole life came down to trying to take care of a mother in a nursing home nearby who was dying, and a daughter who every morning has to get on a bus and go to school, and Laura has to be there when the bus stops, because if Laura's not there, what's going to happen to their daughter Meredith? Laura had a dream. She used to have a dream in which she and Brent and their two daughters were in a car, and they could see up ahead. There was kind of a shimmering in the roadway, and it was a puddle. And then the closer they got to it, it wasn't a puddle. It was deep water, and they were going into it. And Brent was no longer in the car. It was just Laura and the girls, and they were sinking. And she realized she had time only to save one of them. And who was it going to be? And she would always wake up before she had to decide. But her feeling, if she's not there to meet that bus when it comes home and Meredith gets off, is the dream has come true for her. She's made her decision. So seeing, she's a great soul. I liked writing about her so much, and getting the chance so intimately to bring this hidden, somewhat quote-unquote ordinary life to life, and it's not ordinary at all. It's just, again, what she went through it spoke to me anyway.
Yes, another question.
Yeah, were or are Brent and Laura able to find other like-minded people in the community or somewhere in the state or whatever?
Sure.
Organizations of any sort that can.
Well, they
help with this?
lead pretty quiet lives. You know, their family is pretty much their central unit. They don't socialize a whole lot, and it's not because of the political moment. It's just they're kind of quiet people.
Right.
But Brent, for instance, very close family. His family, they're still in Mississippi, and they're much more conservative than he might be, and there are a lot of Trump supporters in his family, and that was another worry of his. This book's going to come out, and they're going to.
Right.
And how's that going to affect his relationship with his family?
Sure.
But so far they've been very good conversations. So bit by bit, you know, it's not like he's in search of like-minded people, but he is in search of people to talk to. One of the things that was so important to him when he came back from his deployment in Iraq, they were in Kansas then, and there was a coffee shop he would go to called Rodina's, and he loved that place. He loved it because you would go in there and there was a table of regulars, and they'd all bitch and moan about the news of the day. But underlying everything was a kind of civility where they just really liked a cup of coffee and talking to each other. And that's a version of life that Brent wanted. He doesn't want to be around like-minded people. He just wants to be around people who won't go off and become extreme and will be thoughtful in their conversations. And those people are everywhere.
I understand. Thank you. That's good answers.
It's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, final question.
Before I haven't read this book yet, but I read your 2 previous books just now and wept my way through both of them. And I told David and Linda Marinus I will cry through this one as well, I'm sure. I found out I was actually in Iraq when I think just about the time you were. I was there in 2008. I'm setting up the refugee program for the SIVs, and all this makes me cry. But what I wanted to ask you is this. Did he keep up? These books to me look like almost like a trilogy. You start with the book in the 2007 period, then you move on to the next stage. And now and each time it's a smaller and more discrete group that you focus in on, which I think is a phenomenal way to put these 3 books together. Did he actually keep up with any of his military colleagues going back to his time, or is this part of the thing about just sort of staying away from people? To avoid difficult conversations.
No, I think the answer is in the middle. There's some he keeps up with, and you would know this from your time as well. There's some people you keep up with, and some people you move on from. So he's not shy about keeping up with people from that time. It's he thinks about it every day, but it's not central to his life. It's that experience was part of his life, and you know it's funny when. I don't think, well, I shouldn't say that. Random House has been great on this book, I have to say. They want this to be a standalone book. You don't need the first 2 to read this book, and I think that's true. I tried to craft it that way. At the same time, I was so lucky with this original group of guys. They were so... I mean, they were knuckleheads. You have 800 guys, you're going to have brilliant guys and knuckleheads and everything in between. But they were such an interesting group that to be able to go in and select somebody from the original group and then explore the next version of America that was underway is what a gift. So the first book was the first book, and when it came time a few years later to write about what people were going through now that they were home. They weren't in war anymore, but the war was still in them, and they were trying to stay alive. They were trying not to commit suicide. They were trying not to get in fights and get divorced and this and that. Take somebody from that original group and use them in the next version of America's story. And then when we hit 2016, and again, as I said at the beginning, I felt like we had moved into a moment of a moral reckoning, to be able to go back to Brent, who I knew from that time as an incredibly moral person, grab him and then bring him into this moment and watch him navigate this moment, that's a gift and a great character.
Okay, that's a great way to end, too. Thank you.